Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. So today we've got a delightful guest for you. Well, every guest is delightful, and it's a delight to speak to my our fellow adoptees. I love this. So welcome to the show, Elena Hall. Hi, Elena.
Hi, nice to
Hi.
have you and see you and everything.
Yeah. So a fellow adoptee, and you're also an author, like so many of the guests. Um, I found this site that lists adoptee books, and it's called Adoptee Reading, and this first off, I was totally blown away by the number of adoptees who are out there writing books, and like people, when I mention it to people, they haven't heard of it. So it's at adopteereading.com, and that's where I found Eleanor. So she's a fellow adoptee. She is also a social worker. She's been explaining to me what the letters stand for. So she is an LMSW, which is a licensed master's social worker. And some people are at the next level up to become a licensed clinical social worker, an LCSW in the States. That requires 1,000 hours, which Eleanor's working on, but 1,000 hours is a lot. So social worker, adoptee, and author. And before we had a chat 3-4 weeks ago, and we've just been chatting again. And the topic that we've landed on for today is identity. So why identity? Why is that important to you? Why is that an important topic to discuss? I don't know.
I think identity can be looked at from the macro level and the micro level, but also identity is something that can be so intertwined and so everyday, affecting everyone's worldview.
Yeah,
So how I see myself, how others see me, all of that combined kind of connects identity. So if someone walks up to you and says, wow, I've always or how about this, like when maybe before I was married, someone would maybe go up to me and say, oh my gosh, you and so would be so great together. And you meet so and you're thinking, oh my gosh, that was really not a great date. Like, I don't know what in the world that person thought of. Like, why did that person think we would be such a good match, right? So then you might have some sort of, not necessarily identity crisis, but maybe just go into, I wonder what about me presented to be a good fit for that other person. And so that's just a simple example of how our life and our worldview is not always necessarily how people see us either, for the good or the bad.
so I guess you're talking about an external view of identity rather than an internal view of identity. Normally we normally think of how we see ourselves, but you're talking about how others see us. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that you can't separate them always. So if someone comes to you and says, yeah, hey, I think X, Y, and Z, then it might cause a self-reflection moment and say, okay, I wonder what about me led them to think that. And so I think that identity is something that is often to be rethought of and explained, and especially when people go through self-care and self-help, right? Like if someone's like, I want to improve this area of my life, that's going to require some more identity formation too. I think the issue is that being an adoptee, your identity starts off, or at least somewhere in your adoptee journey, your identity starts off as misformed or unknown, like a piece of unknown is in there usually for everybody. Even if they have an open adoption, there's still some parts of, oh my gosh, what if this happened, what if this happened, um and that can really break apart people's identity. So how are we building it back?
Yeah.
And there's healthy ways to build it back, there's unhealthy ways to build it back, right? But I think that's why those outside influences are important, because it helps you build it back for better or for worse, right?
So I was just reaching I was just reaching behind my computer, and Eleanor's probably wondering what was going on. I was pretty sure that identity is one of the 7 core issues in adoption, and it is. So I've just got this book. It's by Alison Davis Maxon, has been on the podcast, and a lady called Sharon Kaplan Rosier, ROSZ or Z, as you guys would say, IA. And yeah, identity is one of the core issues that people have looked at, identified. So I guess that's another reason for looking at it, because it is such a central issue. For me, I've spent a lot of time thinking about identity, and some of that may come into the conversation, but really these podcasts I'm trying as much as possible for it to be a dialogue and a conversation between the two of us, me and the guests, or if there's 3, the 3 of us. Identity, I see identity in quite an interesting, different way, and that might come in. But before I get into my take on it, what do you mean by macro and micro?
Yeah, so in social work, at least in the state of Texas where I live, macro means essentially big picture, and micro means more individual focused. So our macro identity is what someone that doesn't know me sees a picture of me, right? And they might assign certain characteristics based on my race, my gender, if they know what I do as a job. And then my micro identity is something that's more interpersonal relationships. So my friends, my family, and how those people see me. And then of course there's also my self identity. So who am I, what affects me? So that's my religion, my hopes, my beliefs, my adoptee background, right? So I think there's different levels.
Okay. Wow. So we've got no wonder we get confused, right? Because you've got basically how a bigger group of people see a distance view of you from the external side, or us, a distance view of us. We've got a up close and personal view of us from the outside, and we've also got the internal view, how we see ourselves. So you mentioned that the combination, how these two combine, the external and the internal view. So how do you see that relationship?
I think it's kind of up to the person, but I think it depends on where are you finding your identity from? Are you getting your identity from strangers' comments on the internet, right? Like that's why I think young people are so moldable, maybe in an unhealthy way, with bad boundaries on the internet, because they're like, oh my gosh, this one person didn't like my video, so I'm worthless, right? Like, where do you assign your worth? Or do you assign it from your best friend saying, oh my gosh, I see X, Y, and Z qualities about you? And so I think those can kind of merge in different ways. And it's up to the individual to figure out, like, what are they going to see value in, right? And so a big part of my identity is my faith, and my faith tells me that I do have worth. But then if someone close to me or not as close to me says, well, I don't have worth, I'm going to go back to my main identity source, which is my religion. But then other people have other identity sources, right? Where do they find their definition of identity for them? So, and I think it's important and interesting.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I would never actually think that identity is an external thing. I have always purely focused on I am who I am, whatever that is, but I've always focused on it from an internal perspective, never an external perspective. That's not to say that what other people say about me doesn't impact me, right?
Yeah. Sure.
But I would never see identity as an external thing. So when I like the way that you're linking identity with self-esteem. So it's the self and the self-esteem. To me, it also links into the adoption space through the primal wound. So one of the questions I came up with, and it's a little bit of a weird one. I think I've not heard anybody else saying this. Is
I'm ready.
Yeah, what's wounded by the primal wound? So what is it that's wounded? So do you want it? Does anything come to your mind when you hear that question?
I like that question a lot. And I think that the first thing that came to mind is some level of knowns, KNOWS, the opposite of unknowns, some level of knowns or security. And then, of course, brain development or reading books like The Primal Wound. Of course, there's a biological component that is also physically broken with parent separation. But I think that's the first thing that came to mind, is that there's just automatically going to be more unknowns in that person's life. And I think security, just in general, there's more insecurity and more unknowns.
Okay. So the way I see it is that the primal wound has hurt my feelings. Okay, so I have felt wounded. But so the first word is feelings. The primal wound has hurt my feelings, and the next one that came to mind is the primal wound has wounded my self-identity, or my sense of self, or my ego, right? And I'm using those three things interchangeably: sense of self, idea of self, and ego. It's helped me, but my sense of self, my ego, they're not who I truly am. They're not the essence of of who I am. So my perception of who I am is different to who I truly am. Does that make any sense, or does that sound like mumbo jumbo rubbish?
I think you're saying that how I heard it is how you see yourself internally with your identity and how maybe other people see you. The primal wound has affected that.
Yes. So if somebody hasn't read The Primal Wound, then they're not gonna see me as wounded. They're not going to say, oh, Simon's been wounded by the primal wound, because they have no knowledge of it, right?
Right.
But in terms of, and same for me, really. So I didn't feel wounded until I read The Primal Wound.
It was a validating wound.
It was validating, yeah. and that became a slippery slope. So I think my question was, maybe I've got some adoption issues, okay? Or I think we all do. So yeah, I've had some evidence. I've felt internally some evidence of potential selective, but I hadn't kind of summed it up, and I hadn't seen I hadn't seen myself as wounded. Now, that's just my take on it, and what I've learned in terms of the size of the primal wounds. I talked about this quite a lot. For simplicity and an overview, is that I feel that my primal wound was like a paper cut, whereas some adoptees' primal wounds is more like at the other extreme of the scale. It's like they've had a chunk of them bitten out of them, like the great white shark in the Jaws movie, right? So there's a continuum. The size of the wound is different.
I think that itself is kind of an interesting question of like, what do you see your primal wound as? Because I think I would say mine was like a burn or a scar where it's there, but it's healing, and it's in a place that if I want to show someone that it's there, then I can talk about it.
So you've got a past memory. It's scabbed over, so it's no longer bleeding. It's scabbed over, then it's become a scar. So it's in the past, but you can go back to that past and talk about it as a memory. So and bring that forth from the past into a current conversation. So let's go back to, is anything coming up for you from this?
I think it really would be such an interesting question to just poll a lot of adoptees and see, like, what do you see your wound, is personified the right word? Like, what do you see that kind of looking like in your own life, literally? I feel like I'm a very literal person. And so whenever you said, like, what do you see yours as? I was like, well, what would, when you're describing yours, I was like, I think mine would be more like a scar or something. But I think that would just be an interesting poll to do. Just like, hey, what is, for people listening, like, what do you see your kind of identity marker for adoption as? But I also think it really depends what your adoption story is. So I was adopted at 18 months old internationally in a closed adoption from Russia. So I think that how people's primal wound began can also really affect their own story, because someone that was adopted at age 14 from the United States foster care system, that's going to look different. So it's just going to be very interesting. And of course, their definition of wound would be different as well, but just interesting to think about.
Yeah. So the way I'm very literal as well, actually, on this. And I was adopted at a closed adoption, and it was 5 weeks, but I was only adopted from 50 miles away, right? So I don't have that, didn't have the cultural, the international element. The kind of way I see the trauma is as layers. So we've got the bottom layer is that we all share. It is the primal wound, and that may be larger or thinner. That's the kind of like the base layer. If we're assuming that the primal wound does exist, right? Then you've got the next layer could be some trauma that happens prior to the adoption. So trauma that's happening in the home with the biological mother. Then you've got that international dimension that you've mentioned, a cultural issue. So that's white babies being adopted by white parents, but at a distance, or black babies being adopted by black parents, adopted parents at a distance. Then you've got the kind of like the transracial layer as well. So a white kid, a black kid, often a black kid adopted by white parents. Then you've got you've got trauma that may have happened within the adoptive family. So these are building up of layers of trauma. So there's multiple layers, and each layer has a different thickness. If it's got a different thickness, so there might be some trauma say, that happens, some really extreme trauma that happens in the within the biological family in setting. So there might be some like abuse, right? Or less, a thinner layer would be like neglect, right? So the baby just didn't have, and you've got that. If you've got a lot of people adopted from Russia and those parts of the world, they've been in an orphanage, so there may be some trauma to do with neglect. The fact that it's not one-to-one, it's one person in charge of 12 kids, so you've got a neglect thing going on. But the key thing for me, so that explains, we can start to get a picture of the trauma laying up. But
I don't know why I pictured like a sandwich when you were saying the layers. I don't know if it's because I woke up very early and I'm hungry or what, but I pictured almost like it's a sandwich. It's a messy sandwich, but
yeah, it's a messy sandwich. Yeah, for sure, for sure. It's a sandwich, and it's like a sandwich cake. You've kind of building up. So yeah, maybe a cake, because you've got like a Black Forest gatto, so you've got different layers. So a sandwich is brown bread, butter, ham, butter, brown bread. So you've only got really 3 layers, haven't you? But you might have more layers on a cake. But isn't it great to be able to kind of put a light, come up with a slightly funny take on trauma? Because most of the time, like we're looking at this trauma, and I've got my hands on my head, and I'm tearing my hair out with trauma, and I'm getting very scared of trauma, and trauma's the ultimate enemy, and we're just kind of getting more and more afraid of it. So the monster under the bed is just multiplying. There's not just one monster, there's a series of monsters. And it's, isn't it great to be able to say, yeah, is it a sandwich? Is it a ham sandwich? Or is it a Black Forest gatto? What's your metaphor for the trauma sandwich?
Absolutely. You get to pick the ingredients in your trauma sandwich. And I think a lot of people assume that their trauma sandwich, we'll coin that term. I feel like their trauma sandwich, they may think it has to look like X, Y, and Z, or they may think it has to have, tomatoes instead of pickles or whatever. But I think that no matter what age a person was adopted, hour 1 of life or hour 600 of life, that doesn't mean that they lose an ingredient of the trauma or something. Like everyone's backgrounds are still very valid, even if they were adopted like hour 1 of birth, and I think that non-adoptees, that's just a really big misconception.
Yeah. So as I took us down a side road here, I've come back and I hadn't actually realized how these two things sit. So let me just say it in 5 words, okay? How this connects for me. We are not our trauma. We are not our trauma.
But we're the holder of the sandwich.
We're the holder of the sandwich. We are the holder of the sandwich. Oh, I mean, sometimes, chef, I never cook, right? My signature dish is a frozen pizza.
Okay? Oh, absolutely, same. Yes,
signature dish. But when you see, sometimes my wife does all the cooking. I only do ironing in the house, right? That's the only thing that I do, and I'm normally listening to a podcast while I'm ironing, and I find it really satisfying, because you start with a crumpled shirt, and 5 minutes later, it's pristine. It's razor edged and it's ready to go. But sometimes if I look in one of my wife's cookery books and I see a recipe for a sandwich, I think, do you really need a recipe for a sandwich? You know, is Jamie Oliver really? And yeah, he does actually, because he's got some extra bits in it that do make that make it extra special, whether it's horseradish or, you know, some sort of sauce that you wouldn't normally put with that thing, right? But so we could be the creator, the holder of the sandwich. Are we the chef making the sandwich? I don't think we are we? It's kind of given to us. So yeah, it's definitely not the chef. It's not we didn't create our own trauma. We are the person who has taken that trauma and we are now holding it. And I would say, for myself, when I was holding that trauma, I thought it was me. I thought I was primarily wounded. Me, the essence of me. I thought I've had two main stressors in my life, right? Number one, business. Number two, adoption. With business, I didn't think I was good enough, right? So I didn't think the performance of my business was good enough. But I could do something about that, right? I could go on a training course. I could get a coach. I could read books. I could listen to podcasts. I could join a peer-to-peer mentoring group. And I did all those things, right, to try and improve my business success. But so I could move forward from that. But when I read The Primal Wound, I thought, well, I'm wounded. I am my trauma. I am always going to be chained to this trauma, this primal wound. It's never going to heal. And I'm stuck with it. So I'm stuck with it. So what are my coping strategies? How am I going to get through, given that I am wounded? And then, so I went in search of those coping strategies. It never really occurred to me that I could heal. I stayed in the personal development space, the spiritual kind of world. And then something happened for me, and I realized that who we truly are, that essence of who we are, the essence of my identity, is actually fundamentally unwoundable. We are not our trauma. Our feelings are not who we are. So what do you make of all that?
Well, it's the difference between, well, one, thank you for sharing, and I think that's a really good takeaway. It's the difference between we're not necessarily responsible or the reason for our trauma, but we are responsible for how we hold it and take care of it. So while we're not necessarily the cause, we are maybe collaterally the effect. And that, that affects our life. And if it affects our life, it affects our identity. So.
Yeah. So before we started, listeners, I said to Eleanor that as I have these conversations, I am conscious that it is a conversation. I am conscious that the podcast is all about bringing the guest's perspective to this. So we're sharing our perspectives, and the balance to which we share will vary. So I did a podcast the other day with another adoptee, and it was an area that I was less familiar with. So she was leading more. and I was asking more questions. Whereas this one here about the identity and going into primal wound, this is at the very guts of what I'm fascinated by. So sometimes sometimes it's more of me sharing my perspective, but Eleanor hasn't hung up on the Zoom call yet, and she's smiling. So I'm guessing that you're okay with this. So I'm just checking
Absolutely.
you're okay with this, yeah?
Yeah, I think people could walk around saying, trauma sandwich or anything now. I feel like maybe we've helped some people with some good visuals for what their story is.
What the story is, yeah. So yeah, it is. We're looking at a metaphor. Yeah, we're looking at different metaphors. So we're trying to. So a metaphor for metaphors is the Invisible Man, right? Have you seen the film? Have you seen films, The Invisible Man? No. Okay, maybe it's a bit old. So the Invisible Man is invisible until you can't see him at all. So he only becomes clear, he only becomes visible when he puts his suit on, right? So he puts a suit jacket on and you can see the top of his body. He wraps some bandages around his head and you can see his head. So metaphors are about that. That's a metaphor for metaphors. We're taking something that is invisible, like trauma, and we're making a metaphor out of it so that we can, because our minds can only deal with the concrete, or our minds can deal more effectively with something that's concrete rather than something that's abstract.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to the key thing that you said in terms of we are not responsible for our trauma. Our trauma isn't our fault. But I guess we are. What are we responsible for then? We're responsible for our own healing journey.
We're responsible for how we hold the trauma.
How we hold the trauma.
Yes.
So what? Yeah. So how we hold the trauma. So we're back to the sandwich, right?
I think we're back to the sandwich. Yeah.
So yeah.
Because
how do we hold? I'm getting how we hold a sandwich. I'm getting how we eat it as well, right? But I'm not getting how we hold our trauma. So what do you mean by holding the trauma?
It's kind of like how you were sharing that you went from learning about the primal wound to feeling wounded to then being like, to your revelation about that of I'm not my wound. And it's not like you go from directly cause and effect, right? You didn't just immediately read the book and then think, oh, but I'm not the wound. You had a moment where there was a plateau or a change and you had to just sit with your trauma. And I think everyone has to do that. So even if I have grown in capacity to hold my trauma, it's still there.
Yeah. The thing I was thinking about actually was holding it as you were speaking. I was thinking about like you can kind of we can hold something tightly. We can hold onto something tightly, or we can hold it lightly. So I was talking to my mentor yesterday. Now she has had a lot of trauma in her life, but she's not. But it was within her biological family. So she was abused. So she's had by her dad in every way. So she was talking. So she came through that. She had all sorts of So this happened when she was very young. She had all sorts of problems growing up on the back of that, like bulimia. She was bulimic, as well as the psychological stuff and some court stuff, all sorts of stuff. but she's now a coach, mentor, counselor type person. And she was saying she saw a new client a couple of weeks ago, and after she was trying to show the client a way forward, a healing route, and she said to the client, I get the feeling that you're not ready to move forward.
Yeah.
On this. And she said, but I'm going to leave it with you because it's your decision. And yes. the client came back a couple of days later and said, yeah, I think you're right, Liz. I'm going to give a quick plug for Liz's book. It's called It's Not Your Fault. It's by Elizabeth Ivory. So in the show notes, with the links to Eleanor's books, is going to be a link to Elizabeth Ivory's book. It's called It's Not Your Fault.
Sounds like a good read.
It's brilliant. She said the client said, I'm still happier talking about this. So she wasn't yet ready she was still holding on to her sandwich very tightly. She wasn't ready to let her trauma go. And that was her decision. And that was her, yeah.
It has to be your decision, right?
It has
so
to
as much
be
as external people can say, so social work, a big part of social work is empowering the fellow person to make their decisions, and based on resources and other things that can positively benefit them. But one thing is that I guess I kind of relate it also to if I go to a workout class every week, but I don't always want to go, but it's still my choice to go. So if my friend tells me, hey, go, are you going to go to the workout class? And I say, sure, I'm still the one that has to get into my car and go to the workout class, right? It's not like my friend telling me, oh, you're going to go to the workout class, you're going to have a good time, and you're going to be glad you went. That is not the same thing as me going and doing it. And so it's all about the person making their own decision to kind of take ownership of their reality and saying, okay, I'm going to go. Not a perfect metaphor, or example, but it's the same thing. You have to be the one to figure out what you're gonna do. And I think that's why getting everybody's perspective is so important. That's actually why Through Adopted Eyes was written how it was, because I wanted everyone else's stories to be shared too, just because it's not just me. And I think you share that too from interviewing all of us, right? You know that you're not the only adoptee in the world. So just kind of nice to connect in that way and hear other people's perspectives, because then I think we can learn from other people as well. So
yeah. And I think writing that story down, talking about in a book, talking about it on a podcast, or sharing it with a therapist, or sharing it in a peer-to-peer group, in a group of a group of fellow adoptees, I think that does us immeasurable good.
Absolutely. Yeah. So cathartic.
Cathartic, right. So why do you think that is? I've got a clue.
But we want to build connection as humans, right? And so isolation is very dangerous pretty much always. And so if we are continuing to connect with other people and other other fellow humans like us or ill like us, then it's important to feel, one, that you're not alone, and two, everyone wants to feel heard. So I would say community and respect are probably the two biggest things.
I love that. And I was thinking about yesterday, I was thinking about what does the primal wound give us, right? So it gives us it gives us to a certain extent, it gives us a diagnosis. It gives us a reason. And the mind is looking for a reason. It's looking to explain things. And if we go into a space and we share our story, and other people say, yeah, I feel that way, it gives us, to a certain extent, it gives us, you used the word validation, didn't you, at the top of the conversation? It gives us validation that we're not going nuts. It's like, okay, this person has been through something similar to I've been through. Their sandwich may be slightly different, and yet, because everybody's sandwich is different, everybody's trauma sandwich is different, everybody's experience is different, right?
Yes.
So they're bespoke. They're bespoke. They're not. This isn't a mass market sandwich that's available in every petrol station across the world. We feel that although we may be going slightly mad, we're not going totally mad, because somebody else has felt similar to us. And so there is that validation. But that can sometimes spill over into like trauma bonding, where we all sort of jump in a hole together.
Yeah. And that's why you can't just pull from one place either, right? Like, for instance, if you apply for a job, the boss is wanting to see a well-rounded applicant, even if you're a new applicant. So that's why you list your variety of skills, hobbies, that kind of thing on a job application. It's the same thing with when you're sharing information. You don't want to only pull from people that are like you. So that's why if I talk about adoption, pretty much my favorite place to talk about adoption is with fellow adoptees. But then I also like to get my husband's perspective. He worked as an adoption professional for a couple of years. I love to get my friends' perspective. I have friends that are birth parents and adoptive parents. I like to get my own parents' perspectives. So I think we can't only pull from one place, or else I think it tends to, like you said, that too much of a one of my friends called it a foxhole friend. Like a trauma, too much trauma, it's too one-sided. So I think trying to be I think being trauma informed implies that you're also well-rounded and getting a good source of perspective. And you can still choose which perspective to engage in, but I think it's important not to get stuck in one thing. Like, for instance, I tell people, if they find an online group that they really connect to with other adoptees, still make sure that you're having healthy outlooks in your personal life as well.
Yeah, a foxhole friend. I like that. Just so like the foxhole is, you know, we're at war. I'm thinking First World War. That's where foxholes kind of started off. So you're in and people are, you know, like it's not a great metaphor, is it? It's like wound. It's scary, you know, like cut to the core, primarily wounded. It's a scary metaphor, and we live in a world that gets our attention by scaring us, doesn't it? You know, is your you said that your husband's an adoption professional. Is he an adoptee himself?
He's not, but we actually met working at a foster care and adoption facility, and that's how we met. We both are kind of on to different things now, but it's really interesting because he's TBRI, is yeah, he's TBRI. He taught the classes on TBRI, right? And so it's really fun to have conversations with him that are at a deeper level, one, because he's my husband, but two, because he is trauma informed. And so that's really cool to get his perspective on things. And so sometimes I'll talk to him about just whatever I'm feeling. And it's interesting because to me as an adoptee, that is a very obvious thought. I'm like, oh, of course I think that so and so. And he's like, oh, okay, tell me why that's obvious. And it just reminds me that my worldview and my sandwich is a little bit different than his. And that kind of maybe reminds me a little bit of the primal wound things. So
yeah. Because the first thing that you said was, when you talked about being adopted at 18 months old and it was an international, I was thinking, well, Eleanor's sandwich has a thicker base than mine, and it's got an extra layer that to mine with the international perspective. And maybe she was in a. Were you in a? You in an orphanage? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So you've got at least 2 extra layers to me, and the fact that I was 5 weeks and you were 18 months. There's the layers thicker because of just the time that's involved. And yeah, you haven't stopped smiling all the way through our conversation. Right?
I'm a genuinely pretty happy person. But truly it's just because of my faith and how that really has rooted my identity, because my faith tells me that I have worth and I can find joy no matter where I come from or no matter what I don't know. Right? It's almost like I feel like that first piece of bread is actually invisible just because I don't know really anything about my beginnings, I guess, and that is horrifying at times. It still is, right? I still struggle with that, but I think going back to my identity and who God says I am will forever be a greater joy than that pain of not knowing things. It sounds crazy too, because it's like, how can the joy and the pain coexist? And they can. You can't have positivity by ignoring the pain either, right? So if I didn't leave room for the layers of my sandwich, then it would not be a realistic positivity. It would just be like, oh, everything's great, and it would be maybe more of a denial or not enough self-exploration to identify the layers. But because I've sat with it and continue to do so and still struggle sometimes, but because I've sat with each layer, I'm able to find the joy in the layers still, right? It's almost like it's like I've added, I don't know, I like a lot of sweet things. So it's like I've added some jam instead of, I don't know, salami or something to my layer. I've redefined it.
Yeah. Wow, there's so much there. First thing is that thriving doesn't mean never struggling.
Right.
Thriving adoptees doesn't mean. I was talking to a fellow adoptee yesterday, and it got to my opinion. It occurred to me that perhaps the name of the podcast puts people off, right? Because they think thriving means never struggling. Thriving doesn't mean never struggling. I have meltdowns off, not usually on the podcast itself, right? But I have meltdowns. I guess hopefully the meltdowns last longer and not as deep as they were. So I want to go back to the central topic that we started out with was identity, and you mentioned faith a couple of times. So how does your faith impact your identity? Is the word impact the right word? Determine? What would you call it? Drive? I don't know how.
I feel like it kind of defines it.
Right. Okay. So how does your faith? That's a better answer then. I'll ask a question better. How does your faith define your identity?
to me, Jesus wants a personal relationship with me, and he tells me that I was knitted together in my mother's wound and that I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. And he would tell you the same thing. So, because the God of the universe wants a personal relationship with me, I think that's pretty cool. And so, because he's defined me as perfect, even before I was born, perfect does not mean sinless or anything like that. We still have our own sin, and where I'm not perfect at all, right? I rely on him for that. But because God has created me and we can be best friends, that's what my identity stands on. So anything else that has happened from there, it matters a lot. It hurts a lot. Adoption things can be really hard. But if I go back to who God made me and that my worth is not determined by missing time, by missing information, but who God says I am, then that is always going to be a stronger foundation than me as a sinful human who has no idea what I'm doing most of the time. And I think that that is something that I will always find joy in, because that's not changing. Whereas my circumstances change, my life may change, I might have a bad day or, whatever. But that identity in my faith doesn't change. And that is something that is so peaceful, especially when I'm, having a bad day or really just sad about, birth parents, or, I pray for them and things, but, it's just, it's hard sometimes not knowing information. So being able to go back to that is really special. And it's the main way that I've found to cope, and everyone's has their own way, right? So but I can tell you that I would recommend.
Yeah. So yeah, I love there's an interesting juxtaposition there, right? So between depth and coping. So coping for me feels quite, you were talking at real depth and profundity there. And I love that. Yeah. I'm not a religious guy myself, but I know enough. Where I went to a school where we sung hymns every morning and had lessons, and so I kind of nothing about it. But that has real gravitas, and it's like an anchor to me. But interesting, you use the word cope. Cope doesn't really do it justice quite to me. I don't. And I don't know why I'm telling you. I don't know why I'm saying that. So, faith defines your identity, and so does, in a religious way. Then, if we to sum it up, we're talking about being a child, a perfect, imperfect child of God. Would that be a kind of a summation of it? Would that kind of work?
Yeah, I'm an imperfect human, but I feel like with God defining my worth, that's really important. So I guess he helps me define my worth.
Yeah.
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 He's the dictionary I'm getting the definition from, right?
Yeah. So for me, that's identity. So I use this quote quite a lot, by a French philosopher or Jesuit priest or something, and he said, or philosopher, I'm not quite sure. He said that we're not human beings having a spiritual experience. We're spiritual beings, one spiritual being having
a human experience,
7 billion human experiences. So
yeah. I like that.
So I'm kind of, I'm equating spiritual being with child of God. I'm just yeah, that's kind of how I'm
I think identity is just so complex because now we've seen I see identity as macro, micro, but also in, internally, externally, it's a lot. It's a lot.
It's a lot, but the power, the power, the most powerful thing that's landed for me in our conversation is that faith defines your identity. How you see yourself through the faith, the lens of faith, is what's helped you use the word horror, right? So how you see yourself is the ultimate kind of defense shield against the monsters.
Mm.
So that's not complex. If identity is complex, right? If we say, I said at the start, right, identity is complex, we've got different takes on it, it's a multiple layered thing, and it's confusing. But if we kind of put that all to one side, the power is the most powerful thing that you've discovered in your life that keeps the smile on your face is your faith. So it's like we had Emma Stevens on the podcast, and she talks about the I think she talks about the mystery of healing in her book, The Gathering Place. The mystery of healing. So my take on that is that healing is a spiritual healing trumps psychological healing. And I'm sorry for anybody using the Trump word. I keep on thinking I need to think of a different word to the word Trump, because it's a Marmite thing. Have you heard of this? Have you heard this thing? Have you heard a thing called Marmite? Okay, well, it's yeast extract. It's a brown sauce, like yeast extract, that people put on their sandwiches, right?
Yes.
Cheese and Marmite, right? It's like brown sauce. And they had a fantastic ad campaign in the 80s because people love it or hate it. Right? So it's like people saying in the UK, it's like Marmite, which means you love it or you hate it. So so I kind of identify whether you're a lover or a hater of Marmite, right? And it's the same with Trump, right? There's no middle ground. So Emma Stevens talked about the mystery of healing, the mystic side of healing, the spiritual side of healing, rather than the psychological side to healing. And as I was saying that the spirit trumps psychology, essentially. That's kind of my view. What do you think?
I think that our brains are part of us, and I think our souls are also part of us. And so I think that it would be hard for everyone with different worldviews to figure out which one is higher up on the hierarchy for them. But I do think that because my faith first comes from my soul and then the rest of my body, that I guess spirituality would be more important in healing than the brain part of it. But the brain part of it also knows that just like I need to test and see what the best influences are, right? How we talked about how I don't want to just get adoptee healing and help from just one peer group, right? Like I want to talk to different people about my experiences. I also want to make sure that I am testing and approving and seeing what the spiritual sources too, right? To see like, okay, well, what if my faith and my religion says X, Y, and Z? How does that actually work, right? Don't just accept spiritual things as fact, like really test it and see what it is, or else it's just like another post on the internet, right? Are you going to believe everything you see? So make sure that you're really reading and seeing what there is out there for you. And I think that sometimes people are really scared to get in touch with spirituality and faith because it's done a lot of bad things and people have a lot of hurt from it. And I think that's very valid. But I know that the God that I'm best friends with doesn't have that hurtful view. And it's hard when the world tells us that there's so many different things. And so I understand if not everybody finds their hope in spirituality, but yeah, I think spirituality would have a higher hierarchy.
Yeah. So I love the way that you expressed that. I thought it's beautiful. I'd say that we're not. I'm just drawing a little. I'm just drawing a little kind of process here. So what we're doing is we're not our trauma. So our trauma is made of thoughts and feelings. So the process goes, we're not our feelings. So we're not our heart. We're not our thoughts. So we're not our brain. We are, in your words, or in my words, actually, we are children of God from a religious perspective, or from my perspective, we are a non-religious perspective, we are our spirit, or we are consciousness. So the ultimate thing here that we're doing is we're trying to separate who we are. And people have heard me. Have you seen me doing the fist and the diamond thing?
Yes.
Yeah. People of the diamond, right? So the clenched fist is the metaphor for our trauma. Opening the palm of the clenched fist, we see the diamond that is hidden by the clenched fist of our trauma. So I start off with one hand holding the diamond, and then I go to two hands. So I'm separating I've got my right fist. Sorry, this is great for a podcast because this is audio. I'm holding the metaphor. I'm holding my finger. So my right hand is still in the fist. My left hand is holding the diamond, and I'm actually moving them further and further away. So they start off really close, and then we're stretching them far back. So we are not our trauma.
It goes back to the positivity doesn't mean ignoring the pain, and that's kind of, I think, my diamond equivalent that I say a lot.
Okay, so give us more on that. Positivity
Does not mean ignoring pain.
And that kind of leads, I think that leads into the title of one of your books, isn't it? It's
Adoption is both.
Adoption is both. So
yes, that's a kid's book. That's a pretty big, deep thought for a kid's book. But Adoption is both is all about It's really for families to start the conversations around the complexities of adoption, but at its core, adoption can be happy, adoption can be sad, adoption can make our heart hurt or make it feel glad. And so the entire book goes through in a cute rhyming way, how it's okay for adoptees, especially children, to hold space for both happier or sad or more sad emotions. And I'm not telling the adoptee what feelings to feel, but I'm also saying that there's room for a lot of feelings. I think a lot of parents are concerned that they're introducing sadness or they're introducing the primal wound to their child, and that's just really not the case. The kid is already going to figure that part out. They're already going to have some sadness, right? Because they're human and we experience a lot of emotions, but that was really important.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So there's the book for kids, and then there's the you've also got the collection of stories as well. What's that book called?
Through Adopted Eyes is the collection of like 50 adoptees all answering questions and talking about their adoption stories. What's the best part about being adopted? What's the worst part? What's all of that. And it's been really, really fun to read everyone's stories. So.
Yeah, and a great way to tune in to 50 different perspectives, because perspective is everything, and it's a word that you use quite a lot. So but yeah, so if you're wondering, well, how do it's about, I guess it's been about being open to different perspectives, and the stories book gives you a simple way to do that. You've got 50 different perspectives of it, so you can kind of compare and contrast. You can look at you can compare sandwiches. You can compare sandwiches, yeah.
I think so.
Trauma sandwiches. So that would be a good one. You could do like a illustrated version, and have people illustrate their sandwich. Yeah,
I love that. I feel like we're onto something.
Yeah,
that'd be cool.
So it relates to an exercise that I did 2009. So I mentioned this mentor of mine, Elizabeth Ivory, the book, who links to Eleanor's books, links to and a website, links to Liz's book in the show notes, listeners. So I'd spent 5 days with her and her now husband, and another 4 or 5 of us, nothing to do with adoption, but all to do with identity. And we did sausage machine day, right? So we get out of life what we put in. So, like, if you want a pork sausage, assuming you're not Jewish, right, and you're not into kosher stuff, if you want a pork sausage, then what do you put in? Pork, right? If you want a beef sausage, then you put beef in, right? Most of us want to be happy, to want a happy sausage, but we're not putting in to the sausage machine what we want, because we're not choosing our ingredients. Our ingredients have been chosen for us by what we've been through in life. So it's about, that's why the book's called It's Not Your Fault. Liz's book is called It's Not Your Fault. It's not your fault because you're not choosing your ingredients. So we're off the hook, right? It's not our fault that we're feeling.
And how freeing is that, right? That it's not, yeah.
So yeah, the sandwich, the trauma sandwich idea sits pretty well with the sausage machine idea.
Yeah, we have a whole menu going. This is great.
A menu going, yeah. Maybe we're going to try some Marmite out as well. I'm in the hate. I'm in the hate camp of Marmite. Yeah,
I probably am too. I'm pretty picky. So.
And you like sweet things. Marmite's quite savoury. Yeah. So it's been a fantastic conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it too. You've been smiling.
Absolutely. Thank you. I know it's so fun.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with the listeners?
I think I would just say that if you're listening and you don't know where to start, or you've never shared your adoption story, or talked to other adoptees, just make sure that you have safe, trusted people to share with, and don't be afraid to reach out for help, because we all need help. So don't be afraid to reach out and talk about it.
Yeah. And something that occurred to me as you were talking about the different perspectives, I would say that from my experience, in-person groups tend to be more, more healthy than groups I've seen, online groups. They're very different. They're very different places. In the same way as people are far nicer to one another face to face than they are from behind an email.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We put things in emails that we would never dare to say to people's faces sometimes. Mm-hmm. Especially if our trauma sandwich is thick and moldy.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot, Elena.
Thank you.
And listeners, do check out what Elena's doing. And I talked about the authors things earlier on, and I talked about, Elena's just talked about the importance of sharing your story. I think one of the great things about having authors on the show is that cathartic process of writing has brought has given the authors some perspective and a little bit of distance, so they are ahead on the healing journey. So thanks a lot, Elena. Thanks, listeners, and we'll speak to you very soon. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.